Sincerely, my response to that is rip. Hey, hi, hello, welcome in or welcome back to my channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Today we're going to be focusing on the second half of the Legacy of God series by Rina. That's going to be God of Ruin, God of Fury, and God of War. And then we're going to go through a full series overview at the end of the video. Go check out my previous video if you want to hear about the first 3 books in the series. So let's jump right in. God of Ruin. God of Ruin focuses on Landon and Mia's story, Landon being another psychopath in the group of heathens and elites, and Mia not being able to speak because of past trauma, which obviously is going to factor into the story as well. I just want to start out with saying that this book had a lot of reviews that were essentially saying that the story was a combination of both God of Malice and God of Wrath. Very much agree with that. A lot of things felt a bit recycled, including the artistic side of one of the characters, like Landon and Glyndon, Killian from God of Malice being a psychopath, Landon being a psychopath as well. That conflict of how does a psychopath have the capability to love, and how that factors into the story of their relationships and people getting together. So it really did feel like a lot of things were recycled and used again. But if you did like the other books, you're probably gonna like this one. I will say that I absolutely loved Mia. Unlike some of the other female characters in the books so far, she actually had a backbone and would stand up to Landon. She even went on secret little missions. Like, I loved her Carrie moment right at the start of the book, but she ends up spilling pig's blood on Landon at a big event in front of everybody. I loved the backbone that she had in order to pull that off. And similar to Annika, Mia was also a mafia princess, except for she was described as a goth Barbie. With Landon being an artist, his nickname for Mia was calling her Muse. I actually really loved that. Such a different pace from the previous books of like Little Purple and Brat. Muse is actually very cute and very fitting just because of Landon being an artist. At one point in the book, just because Mia can't speak, she uses American Sign Language, ASL. Landon didn't know ASL previously, but at one point in the book, he says that he watched a couple videos and then managed to learn ASL like basically immediately. And I don't think anyone on the planet Earth has ever learned ASL in like 1 day, 1 week, whatever time period that was extremely short. So that actually made me laugh out loud when that was sort of explained away in like a 1-sentence line of, yeah, I know ASL now. There is one moment in the book that I actually really loved reading that covered Mia being an ASL speaker, was that her brother Nikolai wasn't paying attention to what she was saying. He wasn't looking at her, so she couldn't communicate with him. And to her, that was really painful and hurtful, since that essentially silenced her from being able to share her opinion just because she couldn't verbally speak something out loud. I really liked how that was handled in the books and how she made Nikolai pay attention to her and explain how much that hurt her. That's honestly probably something that a lot of people don't necessarily think about in communication with people that are, deaf or can't speak, that speak ASL, that they need to have eyesight communication and being able to communicate with their hands, those visual cues. So if you're not paying attention to someone or purposely not looking at them, they're not able to communicate with you. And I think that aspect being covered in the book was really interesting. I really liked seeing that little piece of representation for an aspect that people might not think of as much if you're not an ASL speaker or you don't have a need to communicate via ASL. And again, Landon, he has an antisocial personality disorder, so that gets focused on a lot. Very similar to Killian and Eli. The dynamic between Landon and Mia was kind of similar to the Jeremy, Cecily, hunter-prey dynamic that they had. I will say that I didn't see the ending coming at all, and I actually really liked it. I honestly felt kind of bad for how Maya ended the book. Things get kind of resolved for their family, but felt like she kind of got her character assassinated. It felt like she didn't get as much of a wrapped up ending as some of the other characters did. Overall, I gave this a 4.25 out of 5 stars. I wish this wasn't as redundant of the themes and actions and plot lines that happened across God of Malice and God of Wrath, but it was, and that's why I only rated it 4.25. I will say that the action and the ending did a lot of heavy lifting on that rating just because it was so interesting of a wrap up that I just totally didn't expect, and it kind of came out of nowhere. There were a few red herrings, I think, thrown into the book, having that kind of forbidden romance trope added in. And I will say Landon had actually a lot more character depth than like Killian even had. So he really went through a journey of caring more about people, and maybe it was because of Mia, but it also seemed like it was coming from himself as well too. So I actually really liked his character growth in the story. So God of Fury. This is Brandon and Nico's story, and I absolutely loved it. This was one of my favorite books I've ever read. Top 10 type book. This book is really the gem of the series, I think. Again, we saw the forbidden both sides of heathen and elites. This is one where you really have to check the content warnings for the book. It covers a lot of really dark topics, such as suicide, self-harm. Also, a lot of the plotline has to do with thinking behind coming out, the feelings of being unsure of Brandon's sexuality. Nikolai was one of the most entertaining characters I've ever read in my entire life. I was like kicking my feet while I was reading. I loved every single second of his chapters. Nikolai naming his dick Kolya, him sleeping in every location possible, him having a meditation habit of putting his head underwater and seeing how long he can hold his breath. He was just absolutely batshit crazy, and he was one of the best characters I think I've read in such a long time. He was the kind of golden retriever trope, quite literally to the point where he multiple times said woof, as in Brandon coming up to him going, "What are you, a dog?" and him replying, "Woof." I couldn't get enough of that. I absolutely loved him. Just him consistently going after Brandon, supporting him, doing whatever he can to get Brandon to like him back. I think my favorite quote of Nico's through the whole story was, "Even if you hate yourself, I'll love you for the both of us." Sincerely, my response to that is, rip. Could not get enough of him. I also loved how Nico was just absolutely and unashamedly bisexual. He was so sure of himself, and I think that was so cool to read in a story. And it's also such a complete opposite and foil to the way that Brandon feels about himself. Brandon, throughout the book, continually struggles with his sexuality and coming to terms with the fact that he's into Nikolai and likes men. I think that dynamic between them of Nico being so confident in his bisexuality and Bran coming to terms and realizing that he also likes men really complemented each other within the story. Also, this book had demisexual representation, which again, super hard to find in books, and I absolutely loved that it was there and how that was covered. I think Brandon's character was super in-depth, and it showed him struggling with his complex need to have order in his life and to have a schedule, and Nikolai totally throws that out of order. He's basically the opposite of what you would think of when you think of a schedule. Nikolai was able to break down Brandon's walls and get him out of these habits. I don't think I've cried more at a book than in the scenes of kind of hurt comfort as Nico is comforting Brandon as he's working through his past trauma. This book had a lot of really graphically sad and kind of disturbing scenes within it about Brandon's past trauma. I also really loved that Brandon's parents were so accepting of him. Of course, every book has its nicknames. In this case, Nikolai had several nicknames for Brandon, being Prince Charming, Baby, and of course, the Lotus Flower nickname that had been mentioned in the previous Legacy of Gods books whenever Nikolai referred to Brandon. It explained where the Lotus Flower came from as a nickname, but I didn't really get the connection to the story. It was used pretty beautifully though, so I'll give that a pass. I didn't really cringe at any of the nicknames, and that's partly because I loved Nikolai so much. This book also focused a lot on Landon and Brandon's relationship, and you can really see them working through some of their previous issues where they had clashed a bit. A little bit of that is shown at the end of God of Ruin. This book really took it to the next level in terms of them working through some of their problems with each other. Similar to the previous books, now that more and more events have taken place in the timeline, they all have impacts in each other's stories. I feel like you definitely have to read the books that come previous to it. If anything, I would really suggest reading Landon's and Glyndon's books just to be able to get a little more insight into their relationship with Brandon. I will say that because I did read this series in the span of a week, I was starting to get a little bit annoyed at reading the same conversations, the same situations that have happened time after time, just from a different POV. It gets a little bit grating just hearing it over and over and over again. Still necessary to the plot line since all of the stories do interact and tie into each other so much. This book is longer than the others, and I'm 95% sure that's because of all of the spice. This one felt incredibly more spicy in terms of the amounts of scenes of Nikolai and Brandon together. I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. I absolutely loved it. Nikolai and Brandon's relationship is my favorite by far out of the whole series. I think they both had incredible amounts of character depth and development. The relationships of their family and friends also being covered and impacted by them being together. The action was great. It pulled at my heartstrings. I ended up sobbing just because of the topic matter and kind of the main climax of the book. Brandon's journey through this book was incredibly memorable, and I don't think I'm gonna forget this book anytime soon. It was so good. I could so see myself rereading it again. And the last book in the series, God of War. So God of War focuses on Ava and Eli together. This has a really heavy amnesia trope as part of it, along with the 2-year time skip. Everything that happens is essentially pretty fresh. Just to start out, I don't really have a strong liking of the amnesia trope. I think it can be used really well in some cases, but in this case, I think it's just the fact that you spend the whole book trying to figure out what happened during that amnesia period of 2 years. I just really want to get to the end and move the plot forward, find out the answers so much throughout the entire book that I get kind of distracted and impatient. For me, just the trope itself isn't necessarily my favorite. I think part of my feelings on this book center around being frustrated that even with the amnesia trope, Ava just didn't push hard enough to try and figure out what happened in those missing years. Obviously, she wanted to know, but she had multiple opportunities to ask people questions and didn't really take them. Even Landon comes in at one point and hints at her not knowing the whole story. Well, okay, Ava, then why don't you push on it? Why don't you try to find out more about what happened in those missing 2 years? She spends so much time throwing temper tantrums for Eli instead of dedicating some of that time to figure out what happened in those missing years and why those years were missing. Eli annoyed me for the very large majority of the book just because of how he treated Ava. I really wasn't a fan of that. I did not like it at all. I really didn't like Ava either, just because she felt a little bit like a doormat to how awful Eli was treating her throughout the book. Eli was so hot and cold towards her through the whole thing. It does get explained a little bit near the ending, but it just doesn't justify the types of things he said and did. So I ended up really not having that much of a connection to either Eli or Ava, which was kind of sad. At one point, Eli even convinces his staff to kind of lie to her about things that have happened, in gaslighting her into literally not thinking if her thoughts were hallucinations or not. At that point, like, girl, run. If you know that he's lying to you about your own thoughts and the things that you think happened but aren't sure, don't stick with him. Oh my God, run. Ava herself ended up having this kind of master plan of, she, like what was covered in previous books, had kind of been obsessed with Eli from her childhood on, him not really caring about her at all. So in her eyes, she wanted to make him fall in love to get revenge on him and then be able to break his heart. But of course, not really surprisingly, she ends up falling in love with him and then kind of gives up on that plot line partway through. And then of course, the favored, how does this person who's kind of crazy or a psychopath that doesn't have feelings have the capability to love me? Oh, trauma. Ooh. It gives her the, but now I have feelings for you and I'm not sure you're capable of even love. Again, similar to the Landon and Killian story and storylines that have happened previously in other books. The nickname for Ava was Mrs. King, which I actually really did like. And then overall, I gave this 3.25 out of 5 stars. I wish I could rate it higher, but I just really didn't like Eli and Ava as characters for the many reasons I've mentioned previously. I also think the book had the unfortunate audacity to follow God of Fury, and nothing could have followed that. I kind of wish God of Fury was the end of the series. We got what we got. So for the overall series review, I really liked the series. I ended up really liking all of the characters and how much each other played into the plot lines of each story. The series itself focuses on over-the-top possessive men, which kind of half of the books having an antisocial psychopath. There's also a lot of bullying of the women, and the women usually having a super traumatic background. A lot of the plot lines, of course, focus on that traumatic background and either working through that or getting revenge somehow. Always there's a cute nickname thrown in. A lot of repetitive things like artistic abilities of Landon, Brandon, and Glyndon, the predator-prey relationship through a few different stories that you can see. The forbidden love trope between the elites and heathens was also very prominent. And of course, with all of the psychopaths, the discussions of, is this person even capable of love? That happened over 3 books as well. I will say that I loved the family tree. I found that extremely necessary in order to understand the family dynamics, who's related to who's cousins, who's actually related, how do they factor into the heathens versus elites. That was super useful. There also seemed to be several parent POV chapters where they had mild spoilers to what happened in previous other Rina Kent series. It did really add a lot of information in terms of how the parents interact and the family dynamics between the characters. It also gave some insights into the childhood of the main characters that were the focus of each book. I was really hoping that there would have been a full book for Remy. That story got kind of covered in God of War. I wish there was a little bit more. He's such a lively character that it's kind of a shame that he didn't get his own full book to himself. I also wish there could have been a redemption story for Maya, just because she had such a difficult time in Mia's book that I wanted to see her a little bit more redeemed. There will be a spinoff for Gareth called Kiss the Villain coming out March 20th, 2025. I'll probably be reading that because the plot seems really interesting and I honestly really liked the world of the Legacy of God series, so I hope that that continues. And I also want to see more of the serpents. They get teased as this kind of other outside evil group, but they really don't play that much of a factor into the story. I kind of expected to see a lot more of them, but they just really weren't utilized very much in terms of plot. Overall, I'd really recommend the books. I like Rina Kent's writing style. I think she has really interesting characters. I do wish overall they had a little bit more depth. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Leave a comment below on your thoughts on the series. Did you have a favorite book? If you wanted to read one of the books in the series, which book would you read? Catch you in the next video.